so happy we're alive.
Good evening, and welcome to Louisville Late Night. This evening we're in beautiful San Francisco, California. And
a panel on rhetoric and messaging, and I appreciate that panel. I appreciate the points that were made. But I got to tell you, I'm not a fan of rhetoric. I'm not a fan of messaging. To me, this is a real simple issue. The government lies, we tell the truth. That's the end of it. This idea that we need to use rhetoric and hone our message, sometimes it offends me because the bottom line is the government is lying. We have the facts on our side, and what we need to do is get those facts out there. And with that said, I'm going to give a presentation on marijuana use and cannabinoids and the brain. And in a nutshell, this paper, which you can actually read the full paper on our website, is a good example of the fact that the government is lying when they talk about marijuana and when they talk about how the components of marijuana interact with the brain. Your government wouldn't lie, would you? Here's what drug czar John Walters has to say about marijuana in the brain. So if marijuana damages the brain, impairs learning, and contains cancer-causing compounds. That's what he says. What's the science say? First topic I'm going to talk about, and one of the speakers yesterday, actually Ed Rosenthal, touched on this, is this concept of neurogenesis. Literally, neurogenesis is defined as the birth of new neurons. This is a process that takes place most often in prenatal development, and we've also fairly recently discovered that there's also adult neurogenesis too, and it is believed that this process helps to enable organisms to adapt to their environment and influence their learning and memory throughout life. Interestingly, most so-called drugs of abuse, including opiates, alcohol, nicotine, and cocaine, suppress the formation of new neurons in the brain. Marijuana, however, we've discovered, actually has the opposite effect. This was based on a paper published last fall by an international research team out of the University of Saskatchewan. What they did was they took rats and they administered them a synthetic cannabinoid known as HU210. They administered the rats that twice a day for 10 days. Then they waited 1 month after they did this, and they investigated. They looked at the hippocampus part of the brain, and what they found was, and I quote, and you can read it up there, "We show that 1 month after chronic HU210 treatment, rats displayed increased newborn neurons in the hippocampus." And arguably, as importantly, they found no neuronal death following chronic HU210 treatment in adult rats. They concluded cannabinoids appear to be the only illicit drug whose capacity to produce increased hippocampal newborn neurons is positively correlated with its anti-anxiety and antidepressant-like effects. One of the reasons I really point this out too is they're talking about the part of the brain, the hippocampus, that's involved in forming memories, and it is often told, and drug czar John Walters continues to say, not only does marijuana harm the brain, specifically it harms the brain that's involved in the formation of new memories, particularly it harms the hippocampus. This is actually a study that says, unlike alcohol, unlike nicotine, unlike cocaine, the administration at least of this cannabinoid seemed to proliferate neuronal growth in that part of the brain. You might be wondering how they measure anti-anxiety and anti-depression effects in rats. It's actually quite interesting. What they do is they move them to a new environment and they wait to see how long it takes them to eat. And if the rats eat more quickly, they assume they're less depressed. I actually think the fact they were giving them this very strong synthetic cannabinoid twice a day for 10 days, the rats may have just had the munchies, but in this case they also concluded that they happen to be less depressed in addition to stimulating this growth of new brain cells in the hippocampal part of the brain. Another aspect that I want to talk about, cannabis and neuroprotection. Animal studies have shown now for some time that the administration of certain cannabinoids can protect brain cells from dying in cases of stroke, alcohol poisoning, and neurotoxicity associated with a number of ailments, a couple of those being Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and traumatic brain injury. 1998, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This was a study that actually did get some favorable press in this country, probably because it was done by the National Institutes of Mental Health. What they discovered was in animals, I'm sorry, I don't believe they did this one in animals. This was actually a study that was done in culture. But what they discovered was that CBD, which is a non-psychoactive cannabinoid, I'm sorry, this was in animals. I've got actually a lot of studies to go through, and sometimes I get mixed up. What they did was they stimulated the overproduction of a neurotransmitter called a glutamate. Glutamate, when it's overproduced, kills brain cells, generally when there's blunt head trauma or even in cases of stroke. The body overproduces this chemical, and that's what leads to brain death when people have those injuries or ailments. What they did was they stimulated this neurotransmitter in rats. They did it for 10 minutes, and then they gave them CBD to see if, in fact, it would protect the rat brain. What they found out, in fact, was that when they gave them CBD, and in some cases when they gave them delta-9 THC, it did protect the rat brain from cell death, and they did it better than vitamin C and vitamin E, which are commonly administered antioxidants. They concluded that these data also suggest that the naturally occurring non-psychotropic cannabinoid cannabidiol may be potentially useful as a therapeutic agent for the treatment of neurological disorders such as cerebral ischemia, which is a condition that is involved with strokes. They also, when they did this study, they actually gave very low doses to the rats, and the scientists believe that had they given higher doses to the rats, they actually would have been even more effective. If we jump to 2005, a Japanese research team discovered that if you administer CBD in rats, it's also neuroprotective in cases of cerebral infarction, which is localized cell death in the brain because of a reduced blood flow. This also generally happens in cases of stroke. They gave CBD for 24 hours after they induced this situation, and what they found was treatment of CBD significantly reduced the infarct volume in mice in a dose-dependent manner. In other words, the more CBD they gave, the better the results. The less CBD they gave, the results weren't as favorable. They concluded that CBD exerts a neuroprotective effect through its antioxidant, antispasmodic, antiemetic, which means anti-nausea, as well as through vasorelaxation. Really not surprising when you begin to understand cannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system, something one of our speakers, Bob Mellamy, is going to talk about more. We jump to 2005, National Institutes of Mental Health, once again looking at rats. God forbid we could ever do any of these studies in people. Marijuana might be too dangerous or toxic. What they found in this case was, ironically, if you administer CBD to rats at the same time you give them very high doses and dangerous doses of alcohol, that marijuana actually protects the brain against alcohol poisoning in a dose-dependent fashion. Once again, they found that the brain was most protected in the hippocampus part of the brain. Once again, the effect was dose-dependent. Compared to controls, the rats that were treated with CBD actually had 60% greater neuroprotection than the untreated controls. They also, in this study, were comparing the use of CBD to diuretics. Diuretics also have some antioxidant properties. In this case, the CBD did perform better than the diuretics. They concluded that this study provides the first demonstration of CBD as a neuroprotectant in preventing binge ethanol-induced brain injury. We know through working with groups like SAFER that there's at least every year 20,000 deaths attributed to alcohol poisoning. Here we have a study that actually cannabidiol can help counteract that, at least in animals. And one caveat I do want to bring up with these 4 studies talking about neuroprotection. Some of you may be familiar with an agent called dexanabinol. It was a synthetic